And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. While the House of Nisjul was away on annual hunting, fishing, and harvesting season, colonial ethnographer Marcus Barbeau snuck into the Nass Valley, stole the memorial pole, and sold it to the National Museum of Scotland. On today's Open Connection, we begin part 2 of its journey home with Dr. Amy Parent.
So I went back to Nisjul and said, we should write a grant, and we need to put this in the grant, and we're going to go to Scotland and let's see if we can get it back. And so I'm grateful for the partnership that we had with the Lakalzop village government and then later the Niskalis government. But we were able to secure a grant, which enabled us to travel to Scotland for the first time. And this grant became the foundation for the research project, which worked in tandem with our rematriation claim. I also have one other secret I want to share with everybody. You promise not to tell anybody. And that's, I don't have a PhD in museum studies or what I would say totem pole rematriation school. My PhD is in education, and the day that my Uncle Earl asked me to look into this work, I didn't have the heart to tell him that that wasn't my background or my training, and I'm so glad that I didn't, because he continues to take us on a journey, even right now in the present. So I'd also like to acknowledge all of the members of our delegation that traveled with us to Scotland in August 2022 to begin our rematriation process. We went with much uncertainty, but we went with even more determination. And I truly believe that we went with one of our greatest strengths as Niska peoples. We went with our hearts and our minds working as one, with the objective of bringing our pole home. So I'm grateful to our ancestral grandmother, Joanna Moody. I do feel like she helped bring together the right team of people in the right moment. It all kind of fell together within about 2 weeks before we went. I did about 1.5 years of research prior to that and went through sort of some of the processes that we needed for a claim, but really the right people kind of just showed up and we all got on the plane together and went on our adventure. And Pam can attest to that. So I've learned that having the right team is so important. So during our time in Edinburgh, we expressed to the museum, its board, and then to Mr. Angus Robertson, who was a cabinet secretary for the Constitution of External Affairs and Culture for the Government of Scotland, that our reason for coming to Scotland was that we wanted our children to wake up every day and not have to search so hard for the stories of who we are, so that they can experience our family history and our precious family member with us with every breath that they take. Every breath that they take. We spoke about the troubling imperial and colonial history that we've all inherited, and the future that we all have the ability to change for our children and our grandchildren. To provide a brief historical context to our story, I know we have lots of Niska people in the room here, but we had the Niska Final Agreement, and that was really quite foundational to our rematriation claim with the National Museums of Scotland. Specifically, within the Niska Final Agreement, we have Chapter 17, which is dedicated to the return of Niska cultural treasures as part of our treaty. So we voiced that in our assertion to the Government of Scotland, that as a self-governing nation, we did not need Canada or British Columbia with us on this trip. However, we were appreciative of their support following our first trip to Scotland, especially with those airplanes. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Niska Final Agreement, there is an article there that I wrote in collaboration with the Canada Commission for UNESCO, and is available online through my website or through the Canadian Museums Association magazine. So the return of our memorial pole also represents the first rematriation to Niska land since the return of over 300 cultural treasures from the Canadian Museum of History, as well as the Royal British Columbia Museum following the enactment of our treaty in 2000. So the Niska Museum opened in 2011 as a direct outcome of our treaty. And as I mentioned, here's a photo of Dr. Joanne Archibald. She was a woman who trained me. And specifically, she trained me in her methodology that she developed with her solo elders, which is called Indigenous Story Work. And some of you might have read the book that she's written. And so this training enabled me to work with our hereditary system to uphold the power of Indigenous stories legally, spiritually, emotionally, physically, and theoretically to challenge the colonial archive and the work of Marius Barbeau. And I should say also I had a dream team during my doctoral studies because I had an all-Indigenous committee. I had a Palestinian mentor and committee member, Dr. Andre Mazawi, and I also had a tribal Indigenous woman from India, Dr. Hartaj Gill. And so they've also profoundly influenced my scholarship and some of the critical dimensions of my work. So the origin of the research project and the pool's theft, according to our oral memory, was written down, and I was really grateful to be able to co-write a book chapter with Samagat Duke, and that is Chief William Moore, and it's in the book that you see there on the slide. And so we ended up using the draft of this book chapter, and we submitted it to the National Museums of Scotland by our family as part of our claim for the permanent transfer of the pool, which we also reiterated in our testimony when we showed up in that museum. Another thing that I did prior to going to Scotland was that I did my best to build solidarity with other scholars, particularly in Europe, like in England, as well as Scotland and Ireland, the critical scholars that were situated in museum studies, so I could learn from them, but also so I could hopefully have them kind of create a community around that museum of colleagues that were kind of critical of the practice if we had any tensions. And they really did help me. Like I said, two of those scholars invited us to write a book chapter with them, and they showed up at various times in the museum to support us, as did others.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Carved from red cedar in 1860, the House of Nishjul memorial pole tells the story of a warrior destined to become chief before he died in battle. Let us return the conversation as Dr. Parent gives us more background of the person who commissioned it.
So our rematriation story begins in the 1860s and 1870s when our ancestral grandmother, Joanna Moody, had our pole carved and commissioned. So we know, according to other family members, that she lived to be 115 years old. And when we go back and look at the timeline, it would have meant that she was around 25 to 35 years old at most when she had this pole commissioned. So that tells you what kind of a person that she was, tells you about her strength. She had the pole carved to honor Zawit, who was a fallen warrior. And when we look at the pole, you can see the raven on the bottom represents Zawit in that name. We know it was carved by Oye, a prolific carver of his time. And we also know that Joanna undertook leadership in a time of duress. It was a time of some of the worst acts of genocide that we've experienced as Niska peoples. Her leadership also came about during a time of deep grief. Of course, she was experiencing that as she had to have this totem pole commissioned for Zawit. She did the right thing for our house, and we felt her with us ever since in these really synchronistic moments, or when we hit barriers and suddenly something opens and something changes and we feel like it's her. So I initially used the term repatriation in the very beginning in some of the writing and some of the speaking engagements that I did for this project. But as I began to think about it and recognize that we are a matrilineal society, I changed it to rematriation. And that was specifically after I began to engage with the museum. I began to see that these repatriation processes are very much steeped in patriarchal and paternalistic, Eurocentric practices, logics, and laws. So we were very clear in our claim to the National Museums of Scotland that the return of the Nistal pole must center Niska laws, ways of knowing, and being. And as we know, our matriarchs hold leadership roles that are between balance with our respected chiefs and our beloved family members in our houses, our clans, and our nation in order to support our governance as peoples. So I recognize that rematriation is an ongoing process for us due to colonialism. And it's also a process where we welcome our men, two-spirit, and gender-diverse folks in to support and readdress the imbalances caused by colonialism. I'm also realistic. I know we might need the odd leg wrestling match here and there to get us there. And recognizing the diversity of Indigenous peoples, the term rematriation will only apply for those of us that are matrilineal, and recognizing that other terms may also be applied and be useful. But that's my term moving forward after I had that reflection. So when we first went to Scotland in 2022, we shared that Marius Barbeau, the colonial ethnographer who stole our pole, did so without our permission. We did our research. We shared evidence that the Government of Canada, through orders given by Duncan Campbell Scott himself, had given Canada's permission to remove the pole from our village and sell it to the museum. And of course, we know Canada never had that right. We let the people of Scotland know that we wanted the spirit of this pole to be free in our motherlands where it belonged. So this is the first moment when we walked into the museum and were greeted by the National Museums of Scotland staff. So after we entered the museum, we sang our songs and we explained our laws and the stories that were attached to the pole. We began our formal negotiations. And it didn't take long before it became very apparent that we also had a clash of worldviews and misunderstandings about our intentions to bring the pole home with us. There was mutual recognition on the need to create space that could acknowledge both of our legal systems, our laws, and our cultures throughout our worldviews. But in that meeting, we didn't really know how to get there. And in our oral testimony to the National Museums of Scotland, we indicated that we expected the return of the memorial pole without condition to our house and to the Nisga'a government. We expected Niskayuk, our law, and our protocols to be centered and respected, rather than following a procedure that was dictated by Scottish legislation, and their policy was only 1 year old. We reviewed the National Museums of Scotland's policy, which in our terms would be a repatriation policy. For them, it's a really big mouthful. They call it the procedure for considering a request for the permanent transfer of collection of objects to non-UK claimants. Told them they need to change that title too.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Policies are great. They spell out rules and regulations that add order to our lives and our businesses. Sometimes, though, we need to look beyond the policy and use some good old-fashioned common sense. Let us return to the conversation as Dr. Perrin illustrates how hiding behind rules is a convenient way to sidestep accountability.
Told them that their policy wasn't relevant for our discussion. And we told them that we weren't just talking about semantics. We saw that there was a fundamental, different ontological and epistemological differences in understanding the living and the spiritual nature of the pole, as was shared by our hereditary leaders that were with us that day. Sacred belongings are not museum objects that can be owned, and museum procedures only relate to belongings as property. So we provided evidence that the pole was more than an object, it was more than property or a cultural artifact that could be controlled by them. We also had to agree to wait 3 months after we went through negotiations. We talked first to the staff at the museum. We escalated our case to the chair of the board. And then we ended up speaking to a cabinet minister the following day. So we kept on escalating in order to be heard. But by the time we were done after those first 3 days, it was our own delegation that told me that maybe we should wait. I was very insistent that I really felt that we should know within 3 days' time their decision. And I'm not known to be very patient when it comes to working with settler institutions, especially after being in the university for a long time. I told them I hoped that we weren't looking at another Nisga'a treaty in order to get our pole home. But I was also reminded by our delegation that many people in Nisga'a government were still on holiday for the summertime, and many people didn't really know what we're up to unless they were reading the newspaper at that time. So we might need to rethink our time frames and also consider, what if we do get it back? What if we get this pole back? How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to get it home? And so I agreed to wait. We agreed to wait 3 months. We also know that the truths of our history can be told in many different ways. And we were extremely uplifted by the children of Scotland who heard our calls for witnesses. And so we went back to the pole the day that we left, and our Gelda Maliat, our orator, called all the witnesses, a bunch of witnesses who were in the museum that day. There were a bunch of visitors. There's hundreds of people in there on multiple floors. And he explained to them that they were looking at stolen property, and that Samagat Nisdal, that was his property, and we were there to try to bring it home, but we needed their help. And he encouraged them to write to the government of Scotland and to pressure the museum. And so people were looking at us, they're quite quiet. And one of the things I observed was that there's all these little children around, right? And they slowly started coming over with their parents, and they were sort of fascinated by us. And some of their first questions were they wanted to know our language and that they could speak our language, and they wanted to know if they could sing our songs. But they're also children, and they have an innate sense of justice. And they know the difference between right and wrong, and they know you can't steal something. And so they told us, they said, we hope you get your totem pole back. It shouldn't have been taken from you. And so that really uplifted me that day, having the energy of the children. And I think they could feel the spirit of the pole in the same way that we could. It was very powerful, and that was one of the first times I ever felt the energy of a pole right before we walked in. And I know that Samagat Nistal was feeling it at the airport in Vancouver before we even left. It was really good that Pam was there with him by his side, supporting him. So there are many moments that we didn't know the outcome of our efforts and what was going to happen. And in those moments, I think it's always important for us to ask, what is the next right decision? And it's the next right decision that gives us the power to take that next transforming step that we need to do. In our case, we had to call a lawyer. But it's okay, and I can't believe now when I look back at it that we showed up in Europe and we negotiated without anybody there with us. We didn't have a lawyer. So I learned that. Should probably bring one next time. But it's also okay to be scared in situations where we might only know the really one step ahead, right? But I have to say that it's important that our choices reflect our hopes and not our fears. And our choices and our decisions reflect our hopes and not our fears. Because it's those hopes that bring us one step closer to our joys and to our dreams and what we need to do. So on December 1st, 2022, we learned that the pole was going to be returned to us. And I was told by others that were in the meeting that day with us that it was the first time they ever saw me or Jim Aldrich, our legal counsel, be shocked and quiet, not talk in a meeting. It took me almost a week to actually feel the news that we'd gotten the pole home. That's with some of the staff in the museum. That's our return. We're also grateful that on this second trip, we extended our delegation and we had Samagat Duke and we also had Samagat La join us and Bobby Clark.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Mahatma Gandhi stated, "We but mirror the world. All tendencies present in the outer world can be found in the world of our body. If we could change ourselves, the tendencies of the world would also change." In this final segment of Open Connection, Dr. Parent shares how Gaelic children are making that change.
And one of the other things that we asked our colleagues at the museum to ensure was that we would have children present for that ceremony that we did. And in that ceremony, the government of Scotland apologized to us, and as did the museum. And then we undertook our spiritual preparations for the pole to be lowered. And so they invited this really great school of Gaelic school children, and they sang these just gorgeous songs in the Gaelic language. And one of them was like a going away song. And they helped say goodbye to the pole for us. And then we thanked them as witnesses, and we told them that they would hold that memory of the repairing of that relationship between Scotland and our family and our nation. So I can say that our rematriation process, it had bumps along the way, and the press likes to say that it only took a year. But I always like to say, no, it took 94 years. They had our pole in their institution for 94 years. It just took us 1 year of really strong negotiations and work to get it home. But we've also been touched by the incredible acts of solidarity by people around the world who have stepped in once they started learning about what we were trying to do. And I won't have time to share a thank you for everybody, but if you go to my website, I have a lot of thank yous on there on one section. But some of my highlights were, of course, we did make 2 allies in that museum, and they become our lifelong friends, and I'm still collaborating with them, and they're still wanting me to talk to other museums now in Scotland about this project and do some other work within Europe. We received pro bono legal services. We needed a very specialized lawyer for the shipping law, and she stepped in and helped us. And some folks might have seen, if you watch the news, that we had the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces along with coordination of several federal government offices, come in and give us our Christmas present. Mr. Trudeau gave us those 2 airplanes that we needed to get the totem pole home. And on the day that the pole arrived in the NAS, I had colleagues from SFU, from the Cassidy Centre for Educational Justice. They arrived and they surprised us by presenting a bursary to the Niska School District for this project. And so this bursary will support any student in grade 12 who wants to go on to post-secondary and they're interested in rematriation or cultural and language revitalization. And I did ask them to keep it open to other students that are in other locals as well. And so we're just setting up some of the policy around that and how students can apply for that. And we also decided that if a student was to come to SFU, then if they wanted to support their research skill development, then we would be able to give them automatic research assistantship to help them, and they'd come through the center and get that mentorship directly. We also received so many emails from people who were just touched by our story. It became the national news story. I think it was the top national news story on September 29th, the day it came home. And of course, the media carried the story around the world.
It was not just another day of truth and reconciliation, nor was it merely another She Is celebration and Orange Shirt Day. It was also a family reunion.
This pole is spiritual because it's our ancestors, our great-great-grandmother. So we have to get her back on soil.
The Niska Nation welcomed home the pole with many in attendance, but it was a lengthy and complex process of righting a wrong done so many years ago, having been denied a number of times before, finally reaching an understanding showing the grace of the Niska Nation.
The people of the Niska Nation, whose patience and dignity have delivered a deep understanding between our peoples.
With many pieces of the machine finally working together instead of against one another as an example for the world.
There has been a lot of work over the last year involving a lot of people, not only the Scottish Government and the Niska Nation, but also the Canadian Federal Government. As we heard earlier, the British Columbia Government. It's been a real example of working together in partnership to deliver the right result, I think.
But the road was not as smooth as some would like, requiring more than a simple verbal agreement and a handshake. The process needed a written claim from multiple partners deemed as ethnocentric and frustrating, creating essentially double the work for the nation in order to return most anything from artifacts to totem poles. And with some important lessons learned moving forward, the return of other poles in future will hopefully go much more smoothly.
But most of these policies and procedures are only written from one perspective. And so I think that today, if the same colleagues from National Museum Scotland were working on our policy, they likely have a much broader view of the kinds of people that need to be around the table when those policies are crafted.
The Niska Nation are now setting their sights on other national museums holding even further poles in Britain, Germany, and France. With the wake-up call now sent out, the Niska are coming.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.